We're going to be live in just a few minutes.
We're still being muted too. Once we go to mute, we're back in mute.
Okay.
I have 6 o'clock.
Okay, we are live on YouTube, and I am going to work on this issue where people are not able to unmute themselves.
Okay, we're ready to start then. I'll call this meeting to order. This is a Rolesville Board of Commissioners meeting. This is a special meeting, virtual meeting. So with that, we don't have any formality things to do to start with, other than making sure we have a roll call, being that we're virtual here. So, Robin, you want to do the roll?
No, I don't want mine on.
Yes, if everyone can unmute themselves.
Your volume will come through the television since it's AC.
Oh, no, I gotta put my mute on. I gotta put my mute on.
We can hear you, Michelle. So make sure everyone's unmuted first.
I'm live.
Yeah, I think you can unmute yourself now. Give it a try.
Everyone would try it, yes, please.
Yep. Yeah, looks like it's working. So should be able to do the Robin.
Annie, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can. Yep.
Okay, just waiting for a few last people to unmute. Appreciate everyone's patience. All right. All right, hopefully everyone can hear me. I'd like to do a roll call. We will start with our town board in alphabetical order, beginning with Mayor Curran. If you would just indicate that you're present.
I'm present.
Commissioner Sneed.
Try again there, April. I don't know if we heard you or not. Yeah.
Can't hear you.
I'm not seeing her either.
Yeah, I can see
but I
her.
can't hear her.
She's present. Voiceless, but present.
Can't hear her.
Mayor Pro Tem Medley.
I'm here.
Okay. Commissioner Sutton.
Present.
Commissioner Vilga.
Present.
Commissioner Wilson.
Present.
All right, our town board is accounted for. Members of the planning board, member Davion Cross. Is Davion Cross present? Okay, member Donnie Lawrence?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I can hear Donnie, but I can't see him.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. My camera is playing on this end, so I'm used to WebEx meetings, not Zoom. Let me keep messing with it.
Planning board member Mike Moss?
Present.
Thank you. Planning board member Frank Pierce? Mr. Pierce, are you present?
He raised his hand, but he doesn't show being,
Okay,
mic or video.
okay.
I can see my video.
Ronnie, I was prompted to hit Alt-A to unmute.
Alt-A.
Yeah, Alt-A, if you want to, if others can hear me, it might
Okay,
hit.
planning board chairman Mark Powers?
Here.
Thank you. And lastly, planning board member Jim Schwartz? Okay, that concludes the roll call.
Okay, thank you, Robin. And at this time, we'll turn it over to Town Manager Arnold Kelly, and you got it from here on to introduce the presenters tonight and the program that we have in store.
So Mayor and Town Board and Planning Commission, thank you for joining us tonight. The agenda is going to be broken down in two distinct segments. The first segment will be with our Kimberly Horn consultants, Allison Fluitt and Kelly Klepper, who will be going through and updating us on how we are progressing on our comprehensive transportation plan and our uniform development ordinance rewrite. Amazingly enough, for the last 6 months, we've been doing a lot of work, but we really haven't been able to share that work with you. And so they intend to do that tonight and give you an update on where we are progress-wise. Then the second half will be led by Kelly also, and he will be going through the proposed text amendment for the downtown mixed use district. This is the district that's being proposed for the area of the town-owned land and would have to be considered as an amendment for any development in there, such as a cobblestone development. And so this would be the proposed text amendment that we're going to consider tonight and talk to you about. And ultimately, if the board is wanting to approve this, it would be included in the new UDO also. So with that, I just want to turn to Michael real fast and just kind of go through protocol. Michael, do you have any points of reference or points of protocol for the meeting that you want to go over?
No, just a reminder that the meeting's being streamed live to the public, and as we have 3 presentations tonight, we talked about sort of letting the speaker get through their presentation and then kind of saving questions and having a discussion at the end of each of those 3 presentations. So as the speakers are speaking, if we aren't speaking, just have yourself on mute. And then as you want to ask a question, take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask questions. And if anybody's running into technical difficulties or anything, feel free to use the chat function as well. And that's in your menu of services.
Robin, all of a sudden I can see Donnie and all the other pictures are on the side.
Yep.
I've got a full screen of Donnie. Something has happened.
So Donnie, would you please go? Yep, there
Now
you go.
I'm back
Screen share. There you go.
Now I'm back right.
I think Donnie, you're just going to have to go without a camera if you can't get out of the screen share.
That's fine.
Okay, Michael, do you want us to mute during the presentation primarily and let Kelly and Allison do theirs and then wait until questions afterwards? Is that what you said? I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
I think
Okay.
that'll work good.
Okay.
Um,
So is everybody good? All right, with that, then I'm going to turn it over to Allison. Allison will be screen sharing and doing her presentation. Go ahead, Allison.
All right, thank you, Kelly. I will go ahead and pull up my presentation. So hopefully y'all will be able to see this in just a moment. Can you all see my screen?
Thank you, Allison. I was prepared to do that for you.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess I beat you to it just a touch. Let's see. So everybody can see my presentation, hopefully. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you all today. Very excited to speak to everyone, at least virtually, in this setting, and give you an update on the comprehensive transportation plan. Kelly mentioned this, but we have been doing quite a bit of work over the past several months, and it's exciting to be able to share some of the progress that we've made. And I'm excited to hear from you all on any questions that you may have. So certainly take advantage of that, and we'll be happy to have some discussion about this as we move forward and talk about some of the preliminary results that we have.
Allison, if I can interrupt for 1 second.
Please.
If you go into your drop down under view and go to full screen, it'll get rid of some of that superb.
Aha. I knew there was a way to do that. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So the brief agenda for today, wanted to give you just a quick overview. I know that we have had the opportunity to speak to you all before, but just a reminder about what we're trying to do and a recap of our planning process. But then we'll also talk a little bit about our survey results. We have had a chance to engage with the public. And then pivot from our discussion of existing conditions into some initial recommendations. And then we'll talk a little bit about our next steps. So first off, our community transportation plan, which is what we're calling this one, is really intended primarily to think about that transportation vision for the town, thinking about your needs and deficiencies. This is something that you all have had before. You have a CTP, I think it's from 2002. So it's been a few years, and it's a really great opportunity to refresh what was looked at in that document and other subsequent planning documents, and think about specific projects and strategies and also an action plan. So really what we want you all to be able to do with this is use this as a communication tool with stakeholders, with agency partners, with members of the public. This document can be a great tool to say, hey, this is what's on our mind. This is what's really needed here for the town to help move forward from a transportation perspective. So as we think about the key things we're trying to achieve in this planning effort, we're going to certainly start from a place of strength. You have the old CTP, as I mentioned, but also several other subsequent planning efforts that we're able to build upon. And we'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute. And then start thinking about the future. We think about 2045 as our kind of visionary year for this type of planning effort. And that feels a long way off. So we want to think about that kind of visionary perspective, but we also want to think about this as being a plan that also helps you shape your short-term needs. What are the next things that you want to bring to DOT, to the MPO? What are the next things that we want to look at here locally to really move forward and make an impact? And then we think about all the different travel modes as a part of this process as well. So not just roadways, but we're thinking about the transit service that has come into the area and what that could look like in the future, as well as sidewalks and bike facilities, and even thinking about freight movement as it goes through the town. We've had the opportunity already to coordinate with some of our planning partners, and will continue to do so throughout this process. Some of the folks that you all are no doubt familiar with and are going to be very strong partners for us include Wake County, Campo. As you all know, they at the MPO level are ultimately the conduit through which you all are kind of getting your state and federal funding for those projects that may warrant those funds. And then also NCDOT. So just making sure as we go through this process that we're in concert with efforts that are happening at the regional level, at the state level, and also in our neighboring jurisdictions. So in addition, we're also thinking about other planning efforts that are underway. Kelly Arnold teed up the fact that we have the opportunity to actually do our CTP right alongside your UDO update. And that's something that's a little bit of a rare opportunity. We don't always have that chance to do those two in tandem, but what that affords us is the chance to actually make sure that they're really talking to each other as closely as they can. So we want to make sure that the CTP, if there are policies that may need to be identified, that those are communicated over to the UDO, or similarly, if we identify needs through the UDO process, that those can potentially be translated into strategies for the CTP. At the same time that all of this is ongoing, we're also taking into account some of the findings and process from the Rolesville Wake Forest transit study. So as you all know, Rolesville and Wake Forest are working together to take a closer look at what transit could look like in those communities. And that's something that's definitely a great asset to this plan, to be able to have that added level of detail. And then another great asset to this plan is taking into account the benefit of the Northeast Area Study. So the Northeast Area Study is being led by Campo, and that's one of their quadrant studies is what they call them, but just kind of looking at that portion of the MPO area, inclusive of Rolesville, Wake Forest, Zebulon, Knightdale, Wendell, and several other areas, and just thinking about from a regional perspective, what are the connections that need to be made? So we have the chance of kind of having those two things somewhat feed into one another. And I think ultimately that will enhance what is being done for both studies. Our planning process started with the existing conditions and framework, where we gathered a lot of our data, started to understand what had already come before us in terms of previous plans, and then also started to think about what the key considerations were in terms of how we would be guided with this plan's development. And then that transitioned into our second phase, which is our needs and recommendations development. And that's actually the phase that we're in right now. What we'll talk about a little bit later today is some of our initial recommendations for some of those on-road corridors and trying to bring some of those modes together. And that's something that we'll continue to do, because that then translates into the third phase of this process, which is thinking about this from more of an implementation mindset. We want to make sure that we're thinking about prioritization. Which of these things are really going to have the biggest impact and the biggest positive benefit for the town? And also thinking about them realistically. So we try to take a look at costs for the potential recommendations that we've come up with, and who the funding partners may be, and how we need to actually drive those things forward. And then finally putting all of that into the documentation and coming back to you all to talk about adoption. So just a little bit of a recap on engagement. We did have the opportunity to speak to the public and engage with them virtually. As you all know, we've been kind of living in the COVID environment for quite a little while now. And so we did not want to delay our process. So we luckily had the opportunity to partner in with some of the Polco surveying that was already being done across the town in a couple of different ways, and feed into that with a survey that was unique to the community transportation plan. And we'll talk about some survey results in a moment. But in addition to that, we've tried to provide some communications, which you can visit on the town's website and learn more about both the CTP update as well as the UDO update. On the website, you'll see things like project newsletters that we're releasing periodically to just try and make sure that everybody understands the process and the progress that's being made as we go through our steps into CTP development. I mentioned our survey. Our survey was open for a little bit more than a month, and it was conducted online. We had a good response rate. It was publicized in many different arenas by the town, both via the website and social media, as well as through a variety of different email lists. And that communication was brought out to these groups as well. So when taking a look at some of the results, we wanted to be guided by this as we jumped into the initial development of our recommendations. So we wanted to think about things like, how has the transportation system been performing? So just asking that basic question and thinking about it within the time frame of the past 5 years, we've seen that the transportation system, our respondents said, was about half and half between folks that thought it had improved or those that felt it had either stayed the same or worsened. Now, what's unique about this area is that within that 5-year period, the Rolesville bypass was actually completed. So that's something that's fairly unique to this area that many people wouldn't be able to say, and that likely may have contributed to that sense of improvement within that time period. But one of the things that I would point out is that we definitely also heard within this survey that there were particular areas of concern that we wanted to stay focused in on, and certain subject areas as well. Things such as new sidewalks and crosswalks were rated very highly by members of the public as being of high importance. Similarly, maintenance of existing infrastructure and also enhancing streetscapes were rated as essential or very important. So those are all helpful to understand because they speak to just a greater sense of understanding the multimodal nature of what our system is intending to do, and also understanding that it's not just about capital projects, it's about understanding the life cycle of a project. And then what you can see on the right, there's a lot of information to digest there, but we actually asked about a variety of different travel modes to start understanding how people felt the ease of travel was in each of those different modes. And so by looking at some of the green, which indicates either fair or poor, you start to see that transit, bicycle, and pedestrian travel had some of the poorest scores that came through on that. But additionally, things like attractiveness of roads, traffic signal timing, and also congestion and parking were things that emerged as having some concerns that we wanted to give additional consideration to. So another tool that you'd be able to view if you go to our website is taking a look at our existing conditions report. And I know when we went to this group earlier on in our process, we hit some highlights from the existing conditions. So I don't want to cover this in depth during today's presentation, but just suffice it to say that in this report, we have gone into greater depth. This is really our chance to start to understand the background of all the information that we need to know to inform the development of our recommendations. It's divided into 3 major sections: demographics, mobility, and previous plan review. So in our demographics, you'll see some maps as well as other charts and figures to just help understand some of the census data that may be available, and thinking about also some of the travel characteristics that are out there, such as the average commute time, which for Rolesville is higher than that of the remainder of the county. We also have our mobility section, which includes a large variety of different things, everywhere from traffic volumes to congestion levels to pavement quality, and even looking at some of the environmental conditions and destination points that we want to be sensitive to as we start to come up with our recommendations. And then finally, our previous plan review. And in the previous plan review, it's not a voluminous section, but really just intended to be a snapshot of these various different plans so that we can memorialize the fact that those were plans that were considered. We have looked at all of them in a fairly high degree of detail as we've moved on into the formulation of our recommendations. So with all of those things forming the background of our process, that has allowed us to take the first steps into the development of our initial recommendations. And we're calling these our draft on-street recommendations. And just to be very clear what we're talking about with our on-street recommendations, this is really going a little bit further than just saying, you know, a widening versus a new location, let's say. This is really intended to look at a cross-section of the road, understanding the characteristics of a road. So also understanding not just the capacity needs of the roadway, but also understanding pedestrian accommodations and bicycle accommodations. So our hope was that by looking at that cohesively, we can then ultimately build other things around it, such as a collector street network, which will be kind of those smaller level roadways that we may have the opportunity to make some additional connections. And then also building in the findings of the transit study and some other off-street greenway recommendations as well. A quick reminder, our study area for this is not just the town limits or the ETJ, but we're actually considering both the short range and long range urban service areas for the town. This does go out to 2045. We want to make sure that we're being inclusive of all of the areas that may potentially be influenced by the town of Rolesville in the future. And so we include all of those as we go forward. So I've already touched on some of these key considerations, but just to see the process a bit more clearly, what we start with is that initial inventory of existing plans that we captured in our existing conditions report, and then really looking at a reconciliation of those plans. It's been quite a number of years since our 2002 CTP, and many of those plans have come within that time. Not all of those plans necessarily say the same things for the same places. And so we have intentionally gone through and tried to highlight places where we see discrepancies, and then also compared that to what we're seeing from the data side. What are we seeing from congestion data, from safety needs that are being expressed right now, and also from what we're hearing from the public, because that's kind of the latest and greatest information right there. And we want to make sure that it's being considered alongside some of the analysis that was done in those previous plans. So with all of that background, we're also putting in some of the neighboring jurisdictional plans. We mentioned our partnership with some of those agencies. We want to make sure that this plan is not disjointed, that when we go from Rolesville to Wake Forest, or Rolesville to Raleigh, or Rolesville to Wake County, that we have a consistent set of recommendations. Now, that does not necessarily mean that we go in and accept the recommendation that is coming from a neighboring jurisdiction without question. If we do find a discrepancy between what we think should be highlighted here in the town, that's something that we just want to highlight and then go forward with and communicate with that jurisdiction as we go through the process. So all of this resulted in the draft recommendations map. And this was what was included in your packet in advance of this meeting. We have actually been able to coordinate with our steering committee meeting, or our steering committee rather, in advance of this. We had a meeting with them on July 7th and are currently looking to schedule our second meeting with that group as well. During that meeting, we discussed some of the initial skeleton of what would become these on-street recommendations, and have since given them the opportunity to vet some of what is now before you. Our steering committee is largely composed of technical partners. We have some of our agency partners as well as town representation. So when you look at our draft recommendations map, and I have it larger on another screen, and I'm happy to come back to this if you all have questions later, you will see that it includes typical sections We have tried wherever possible to align these with NCDOT designated typical sections. DOT actually has a series of sections that they like to use, and using those same types of sections just allows for easier communication both with them and with Campo. We've also identified new road locations in a few areas. As I mentioned, those typical sections allow us to identify the types of bicycle and pedestrian facilities that we may be interested in for the roadways, and also delineate where we believe curb and gutter versus shoulder treatments may be the most appropriate. So we're trying to get into that level of detail as much as possible because all of those things affect the right-of-way that you may ultimately need for these roadways. And we want to be as proactive as possible in identifying that up front. So you'll also see, this was the table that was included in your packet. This is essentially a complement to the map that was provided that includes the facility name, the extent, the current status, so essentially whether this is an existing facility or whether this would be a new location, and then finally that cross-section description that I just alluded to. And this is just a large version of that map that we can come back to later if others have questions. So finally, just talking about kind of our next steps on this. Prioritization and implementation. Our next steps are to kind of make sure once we have these draft on-street recommendations vetted and have expanded upon our recommendations to include transit integration, off-street greenways wherever practical, and then also collector streets, to move into prioritization. The prioritization process is something that's done at the state level. It's something that's done at the regional level. And so doing it here as well at the town level in a way that pays respect to how it's done at the state and regional levels, but also to your local needs and your local guiding principles will allow us to put together something that is ultimately as responsive as possible while also making you as competitive as possible for future funds. So we'll be working on that prioritization, ultimately translating this into an implementation plan and into our report documentation. We're also going to continue to coordinate with the Northeast Area Study, which is ongoing. We will ultimately move into cost estimating for our projects. And then this is something that's kind of ongoing throughout, continuing alignment between the UDO and CGP to ensure that any policies or strategies that can make sense to share between the two are incorporated. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. And I'll leave up the presentation just in case we want to go into any questions here.
Hey, Allison, this is Ronnie Kern. Thank you for the presentation. It was really well done. Thank you. I know you put a lot of work in it. A couple questions I have, and it's kind of present day issues that we're facing here in Rolesville, is to make sure our comprehensive land use plan and our transportation plan matches. And I'm not confident that it does. In fact, our citizens is telling us it does not, that, that we're developing too dense in some places that the roads will not be able to handle. And, I think as good stewards, and commissioners, we want to make sure that those two things align and align real well. So, and maybe not tonight, but I think at some point in time, we need reinsurance that that those two things are together. So, my first question would be, we got a comprehensive land use plan now that calls for medium density in a lot of these remote areas and these rural areas, like kind of east of town, south of town. And I see your roads on the map here. Are you confident that what you have designed and what you're proposing does meet those comprehensive land use plans that we have approved, and then a way that we can communicate that to our citizens, that if we do develop with the density that we have planned for, that it will all work in the end.
That's a great question. So, and I'm just making some notes here in case you wondered why I was looking down a bunch. So when we talk about the land use plan, that was definitely part of our plan review process as we went into our recommendations identification. So we kind of look at that in a couple of different ways. First, we just look at the future land use map itself, but then we also have the benefit of using the travel demand model, which actually rolls in some of those future land use designations into its calculations. And we've actually run the travel demand model in order to understand what some of the congestion levels may be looking like on these roads to help us understand the types of improvements that might be needed. So that's kind of one step that has helped us with this. But one of the things that we also acknowledge in Rolesville, which you could probably say to some degree in many places in Wake County, but I think particularly so here, is that the rate of change here is so much faster than it is in many places that we need to go a little bit beyond what's even included in the travel demand model. And as such, we're doing a little bit of work with scenario planning. That's something that the Northeast area study is doing, kind of a scenario planning process. And they're really going to be looking at different land use scenarios for that. They compare usually a couple of them and evaluate them just to see how they're doing. And as a part of that, what they'll usually do is they'll have a more dense and intense land use scenario with compact centers, and then oftentimes something that's a little bit more dispersed. But we are working as a part of this to try to inform that a little bit more intelligently, so that when the region does begin that process, it's more reflective of what the town is saying their future land uses may actually represent. So that's our intent there. And again, all of that is hopefully taking this feedback loop so that it then better informs our transportation recommendations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. But I would like to take it a step further, and if we adopt this transportation plan that you have today, I would like to have comfort that our existing comprehensive land use plan will work in this condition. And if not, I think we should go back and change that. We should modify the comprehensive land use plan to adjust to what transportation limits we have, and so we don't overgrow. So is that feasible? And do you agree that we will be able to accomplish that with what we're being provided?
And Ronnie, if I could add to that, do you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you, Jack.
Ronnie, this comprehensive land use plan or this transportation plan is built or is based on our current comprehensive land use plan, which means that's current density. And we've got to remember that every time we change a zoning for more density. Am I correct, Allison? I mean, if it's based on our current plan that it may be R2 and they want R3 with special provisions and smaller.
That's a good.
That's a good question. Throws a screwball into everything.
Yeah, that's a good question. And Allison, I think what I believe it's not. I think this is based on a comprehensive land use plan and not the present day zoning districts. In other words, you're planning the transportation plan is planned on what the future density will look like, and not what we have zoned presently today. Is that correct?
That's correct. So I think the only circumstance in which that concern might arise is if a zoning change was proposed that would exceed that which was included in the future land use plan.
Right. And see, Jack, I don't think we can do that. I don't think we approved anything that exceeds the comprehensive land use plan, So that's why I said, you know, it's very important to make sure our comprehensive land use plan matches our transportation plan. If it don't, then when we do make those changes, Jackie, you know, we're overloading things.
Yes, and that's what I wanted the other commissioners to hear.
Yeah, I think that comment is well taken. And this is actually part of why we are excited to have, and I realize they're certainly distinct endeavors, but why we're excited to have our coordination with the UDO as well as we go through this, because I think there's some overlap there where we start to see some of the policies and direction that are being taken in the UDO may help us understand which thing needs to have precedence. In other words, should it be the transportation system that we're saying, hey, this is as far as we think we can take this, we need to go back and look, you know, retrospectively at the land use, or if we want to say in other areas, no, we know that this is where we need to head from a land use perspective. The transportation needs to step up to match this. And that, I would say the latter is where we approach this from a transportation standpoint. When we typically start a CTP, we start with that assumption that we're trying to rise to the occasion, if you will, to match what is in the future land use condition. But I think we have a little bit of a feedback loop in here with the UDO, just to kind of make sure that we're on track with that.
This is Donnie Lawrence. I'd like to just say this is something that I feel comes up in several planning board meetings, if not every planning board meeting. And basically, if you look at the corridor from Wade Avenue to Mitchell Mill Road, we've discussed it numerous times about that land or that particular road needing to be pretty much 4-lane. I see right now we're looking at Young Street as proposed 2-lane with 2-way left turns. You know, the rest of Rolesville Road looks like 4-lane divided raised median, but, you know, all the in progress developments, you know, schools already, there's several subdivisions already on Averitt Road, several subdivisions approved on East Young Street, Rolesville Road. And, you know, that's the current situation we're in with a lot of the local residents, is the passion that they feel for the traffic, especially on the East Young Street, Rolesville Road side, Mitchell Mill Road, down in that area, that there's just not enough capacity to continue to develop the land. So I think that area really needs to be looked at. But the entire property or corridor from Wade Avenue all the way to Mitchell Mill Road, with all the proposed developments we have, I think really needs to be taken a look at.
As a
And
resident,
one thing that
Donnie, I agree with
I'm
Donnie.
sorry.
100%. As a resident of that road, I agree with Donnie 100%. That's a lot of the feedback I get from my neighbors in the areas around this particular section with the high school, potential athletic fields. That drives even more potential traffic at hours that are not standard hours potentially. So you've got a lot more traffic in the area that's not currently in the plan, I don't think, and not at the densities that we've projected. Townhomes and all brings that density up a little higher than I think people expect.
Now, one thing that I will just mention, and I appreciate those comments, because I think it's not the first time that we've heard those. One of the things that town staff were very proactive about identifying, actually, in the outset of this plan, was giving a little bit more of a close focus on the Averitt Road, Young Street, Rolesville Road corridor in particular, and just starting to understand what that needs to be when it grows up, if you will. And so we have actually looked at the development plans that are underway, recently completed, up until the past couple of years, just to try to get a handle on what has been done there and the level of impact that has been done, just because there's been so much that has happened on that corridor, such a desirable location. And there's still room to grow. I think that's something that's important to note when you look at the area. It's not fully developed yet. But we also want to be considerate of the fact that we have the Main Street corridor study that's also kind of defining some of the character of that area as we get into the downtown of Rolesville too. So there's some discussion that has been had about transition on that road, which is why you see perhaps it looks a little counterintuitive to the first glance. You see the 4 lanes up on north on Averett and south on Rolesville, and then it goes back down to the 2 lane as you go over Main Street. And that is to help be more in character with some of the proposed recommendations that are happening at Main and Young, and kind of coming in and out of that. That is an area that we'd love to hear additional feedback on. If there are any, I guess, concerns or thoughts about other transition points of where that might need to occur, that's certainly something that has been a long-standing discussion throughout this process.
Allison, I think
So just one more.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is Donnie Lawrence again. I was thinking one more proposed thought, or I guess thought we've had, is to bump up the Jones Dairy Road extension to free up the Averett Road, Wade Avenue sections of the road to try to get people over to the 4-lane bypass a little bit quicker than coming through Main Street and Young Street. So I don't know if that's been put into your transportation reviews or not.
So
That's a good question. Ellie,
Go
did you
ahead,
want to
Allison.
weigh in?
Well, I was gonna bring that one up and another one. So go ahead and talk about that one, Allison.
Okay. Yes, we have talked actually about Jones Dairy extension. So what you can see, I don't know if y'all can see my mouse, in kind of the light blue here actually, is the Jones Dairy Road extension. We actually have 2 alternatives shown in case you wondered why it looks funny. We have a couple different alternatives shown in there. Simply because, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but we've been trying to go a little bit beyond what we typically would at a CTP level, and just start to think about if you were to take the first steps into implementation, you would need to have kind of a feasibility study that looked at alternatives, and there are some environmental concerns in that area that we need to be cognizant of. There's also been, those alternatives have already been identified in collaboration with the development that has gone on in that area. So we feel fairly confident in being able to show those as 2 viable options, at least from that consideration. But going back to some of the concerns that have been raised from an environmental level, you see the 2-lane recommendation here. That is one of the primary reasons why you see that recommended as a 2-lane facility. We've also run all of these through the model, and the model seems to indicate that that would not overburden that portion of the road, that folks would, it would not necessitate taking that up to a 4-lane section. But Kelly, did you want to add anything on to what I said?
So just a reminder to the board and planning commission, that was the path there, the diverted path are the 2 options that was adopted in the Chandler Ridge subdivision. And by the time we get done with this study, and we see Allison again, probably for the 3rd or 4th time, we will have a preferred route recommendation. Because if you remember, per the subdivision, per the development agreement, we have to come to a conclusion on one of those. I think it's a year from now or thereabouts. So we'll be studying that, looking at that, and coming up with a preferred that we'll probably end up having to stick with. And then the other part, Allison, just as a point, making it a 2-lane undivided also allows it to be a local street if we are unable and want to move it along sooner than DOT is able to fund a Jones Dairy road extension project. So that would be kind of an allowed opportunity to get that going sooner than maybe waiting on DOT potentially.
Yeah, that's a good.
Yeah, the other one I want to refer to just real quickly, and then before we close off and go to Kelly, and I think we probably want to concerning time a little bit, is just to remind everybody that you have everybody's, we'll make sure you have everybody's emails, and we would ask that you go ahead and study this, and then at your time over the next 2 to 3 weeks or shorter, if you don't want to just do it real fast when you come out of this, drop the staff or the consultant a note with your thoughts. That would probably be the best way to capture in timely fashion. We really are seeking your input, so we can either get that out to you tomorrow, make sure you have that, but that's probably the best way of giving us your thoughts and analysis. Allison, the last one I want you to highlight from my perspective is this Fowler Road extension. So there really are 2 new streets on here. There's the Jones Dairy Road extension, and there's a Fowler Road extension. And again, I think this Fowler Road extension, we're gonna have to get this right in the adopted CTP. And this is the future corridor of kind of much of our next frontier, I call it, of Rolesville potential development and growth, particularly as it relates to commercial and industrial down the line. But that will be a very key extension that when we get this CTP completed, we want to be pretty close to right on that, because that will be then the guiding guide essentially for where we want to go with land use up and down that corridor. So that's the one I wanted to make sure we touched on a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And I would just add to your note about folks offering comments that if you have any questions or feel that you need any information to be able to gather all of your comments, feel free to reach out about that as well.
So Allison, just looking at this chart here that you got displayed, everyone that you touch with a color is some type of improvement. Is that fair to say? Either sidewalk or widening or something?
Yes, so with, we're not really doing anything to bypass here. I did want to point that out. We just wanted to notate it here. It's a little bit unique. But really we're wanting to just show the overall cross sections. Most of these would have some sort of enhancement to them. Some may be fairly minor in nature, like converting from shoulder to curb and gutter in some instances, or as you mentioned, pedestrian and bicycle enhancements, whereas some of them are going to be more capacity enhancing projects. And then this table here, again, also provides kind of a complement to that. Some people digest it better in maps and some people digest it better in the table.
And if we get real lucky, we may still, town board, if you remember, we did apply for the bicycle plan grant. And I don't know, Michael, we should check up on that and get an update to everybody where the status of that is. But if we get real lucky and we can get that money and get that going and get that done before the CTP, we could fold that in here pretty quickly. So that was the goal when we wanted to apply, and then COVID set back the application date. I don't know where they are in the review process, but our hope was that we could get that done at the same time we're doing this and fold them all together. So anyway, I think for sake of time, unless anybody really has anything further, Mayor, are you okay going on to the UDO update?
I am. I just want to open it up and make sure there's no questions from any of the commissioners that haven't asked any. So real quickly, if you do have any questions, let's get them out. So not hearing any, I think we're okay, Kev.
Allison, thank you very much. You've done a great job, and
Thank you.
we'll wrap it up at the end. And Kelly, it's all yours to take over.
Perfect. Well, good evening, everybody. I would definitely say that I would prefer to be there face to face because this makes things so much easier when we're doing this. But is my screen sharing at this point?
I wasn't sure if you were going to do it since Allison did. Let me grab that for you.
Okay, just double checking. I clicked the button, but if it's okay with you, or if you'd prefer, I can let you have control.
Kelly, we can see your screen.
Okay. Great. Well, like I said, I will be upfront and say that Allison has much better looking graphics than I do. She has much cooler maps and some other things, but we will have graphics. We do have graphics. We do have quite a bit of information. So we're going to try to move through this because we do have the two components that we're talking about tonight. First and foremost, of course, is the update to the UDO. And then also we need to make sure we're talking about the proposed amendments to your current town center standards. So in just kind of keeping with the level of the discussion, as Allison said, we continue to kind of work internally so that the CTP and the UDO are working hand in hand, because we understand that what goes on in one is going to affect the other. And at the same time, making sure that it's all kind of also kind of keeping in mind your land use plan. So as we started kind of looking into this, we divided this up into 4 key components, one being what we call the foundations and the framework. The second being the UDO development, and then refinement, and then formal adoption. Now, I will say that Danny, Julian, and I, we were all on a presentation this morning, or a webinar sponsored by the UNC School of Government, where they were kind of talking through some of the changes and core changes since 2019, as well as 2020. So, one of the things I'll definitely say is, there's a lot of work that's being done at this point. There's a lot more work to continue to be done. But at the end of the day, we've already agreed and understood that we've got to meet certain target parameters. Hence the reason why, and Kelly, I'm going to take your thunder for just a second. We'll probably be back before you tentatively in December with a pretty significant update, November, December timeframe. Like I said, so we'll be working with staff on that. So, right now we're showing that we've been in the foundations and the framework components. So we did a pretty extensive analysis of the current UDO, pointed out a lot of things, made some suggestions, been working with staff quite a bit. And so what you're going to kind of see is where we are up to this point. Now I will tell you that we've actually already moved into phase 2, which is the UDO components, and you'll see some of that here in just a moment. So from a table of contents perspective, right now you have 16 sections. What we're identifying or proposing is to actually consolidate several of these components and bring those into a little bit more of a uniform standard, and also keep it, I'll say, a little bit more from a user-friendly approach. So one of the key things that we're already starting to do and look at was taking a look at your current use table, which this is not it. Your current use table is actually in section 4 of the UDO, and starting to look not only at the uses, but also there again, the usability of it. So you'll start to see, we do have the residential districts, we've got our non-residential districts, and then we start talking about mixed use. And that's going to lead us into the discussion tonight, especially is what we're calling the TC, that town center district. So looking at some of those uses, and we've just been asking, I'll say, some tough questions, and staff's been asking back of us of, can we look at making some modifications to the current list? The answer is yes. There are certain standards or certain uses that we want to make sure we retain, and staff's been really good about saying, no, we want to make sure, because there's certain terms or certain meanings that this group, especially our town, understand and relate to. So that's where we say we're going to continue to provide some of those specific standards. Now, of course, what I was just talking about was we've added a new section in this, what we're calling the mixed use districts. Now, keep in mind that the TC is the one we're going to focus in on tonight. And that's the one we've been working with staff on, because we understand that there are some development pressures, so to speak, coming up. The two that you see out here, that SMU and the RMU, those have not been fleshed out or vetted, but we wanted to go ahead and kind of start to formulate and populate the table so that we could understand how is this all going to fit and flow at the end of the day. Use definitions. So one of the things that we also start to do at this point is not only identify what uses can go in what zoning district, but are there, what you see on your screen, the 4 kind of categories or characteristics of each use. And that are there, what are those use characteristics? What are the typical types of accessory uses?
I need to interrupt him. So should I stop sharing?
Oh, do I need to stop, Robin?
It appears we were both sharing. So if you're able to advance your slides, I'm going to just stop sharing.
Okay. Can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So the other thing we say is, what are some common examples of use so that we can clearly define what we're talking about? And then are there additional standards that we're talking about that need to be attached to that specific use? So for example, we talk about recreation or outdoor recreation, and you can see number 1, characteristics. So we're giving you that kind of use identification right there. So you're not having to look in 4 different portions of the UDO. What are the acceptable accessory uses? What are some examples so that Danny and Julie don't have to try to guess it and make interpretations on certain things? And then number 4, which are the use standards. So if there's anything that potentially could be a challenge or an issue, then we want to make sure we're identifying some additional standards that goes along with it. Parking. Parking is a big one. And I know we've been working closely with Danny and Julie on this one. But we're talking about doing a pretty extensive revamp of the current parking code. Why? Because a lot of the standards we're seeing are say older, outdated. We're trying to infuse some additional uses and some additional approaches on how we're calculating and how you actually apply the parking standards. So similar to what we're talking about with the use table is taking the parking information that you have right now, updating it based off of whether it's the APA, the ULI, which is the Urban Land Institute, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, as well as a couple of other sources, including parking studies that we've done, so that we can provide a little bit better range and a better application. And I will say that what we're talking about here is context sensitive to Rolesville. We didn't look at somebody else and go, oh, that's going to fit here. We wanted to make sure that what we're talking about fit within the parameters of the town and fit the town's vision. So we are talking about adding a new kind of approach to this, which is in addition to what you see on the left-hand side of that screen, those the principal uses, we're identifying minimum numbers of required spaces and maximum. And now some people may go, why are we worried about the maximum? Well, what we're seeing more and more, especially where we have either shared or mix of uses, or we are getting better and more efficient transit, that we don't necessarily need all that excess parking. And a lot of times that's parking that is sitting vacant for a majority of the year. The only thing it's doing is either collecting garbage, creating stormwater, creating more heat island, or environmental considerations. So what we said was, well, let's consider a maximum instead. Now, one thing that I'll be very quick to let everybody know about is, oops, wrong button, too quick. Everything that we're talking about has a process that somebody can come in and ask for an exception, what we're calling design alternatives. So that, if somebody's got a different way of approaching that, then they can come to Danny and work through that and say, here's a study that we've done, here's kind of the methodology behind it. And that way the staff can continue to move forward. So while we have, I'll say, specific code standards in the UDO, there's also those provisions to kind of think outside the box if we need to. And more importantly, as things are changing, as we get more information as it relates to parking or changes in use, you're not having to update your code, your UDO, every time that happens. We've already built those flexibilities in. Buffering. Now, one of the things that always comes about is, well, what's going to happen when this project gets built up against this neighborhood? Or what about along the street? So what we've said was, let's come up with some standards that actually start to call out what are those potential perimeter buffer types. And we're calling them, this is really exciting. Buffer types 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. But each one of those has a specific standard, whether it's the width, the number of canopy trees, all the way through to what we're saying, walls or berms. Now, the first take when you'll read that is, okay, that's great, Kelly, but what information is that really showing me? So as part of this is we're proposing to incorporate graphics like this. Now, we kept this one in color just so you could see it a little bit easier, but Danny and I are talking about, we need to make sure that we're providing the black and white. So as we start working through the Muni code and I'll say getting the code online, that, we're meeting certain parameters. But for tonight's purpose, and even some will say some of the fact sheets that we're preparing, we wanted to show you the color so that, when we're looking at buffer type 4, which is in essence 25 feet, and here's the standards that goes with it, that tells you exactly everything you need to know from that table. It says, here's the property line and the distance back. There's our wall, there's our canopy trees, which you can see in the 3 different views, as well as our understory or our shrubs. So that way it's very clear. And there again, we're not asking that every canopy tree be set aside every 50 feet or something like that, so it looks like a row of soldiers. But what it does is we do put provisions in there that allow for the clustering or the grouping, so it can look a little bit more natural as we're doing development. And with that, I wanted to stop and ask if there are any specific questions. And I know we kind of walked through that very quickly because we've got more information. I think probably more detailed discussion needs to occur with the town center. So with that, I will entertain any questions or see if there's anything we can help out with.
Kelly, this is Kelly. So you laid out kind of where we are and where we're going a little bit. I know the board has talked about over the last few months certain elements that they want to make sure get addressed in the UDO.
Yes, sir.
And you touched a little bit like on the buffering and parking, and there may be more. How do you foresee them? When do you want that information? Or when do you think they get that input, or will that become forthcoming more clearly during these updates, or how do you see that transpiring?
Similar to what Allison was talking about, Kelly, if there is a specific topic that the town board or planning board, whoever is interested in making sure we're expediting or really making sure we're focusing in on, is to talk to staff. Let staff know, reach out to us, and we can get you our contact information as well. But because of the nature of the codes and the UDO, we prefer to have kind of everything running through Michael or Danny at this point. So let's say somebody said, hey, I'd like to spend a little bit more time on the buffers or the parking or even street lighting. Then, we're built, and I say we're built because James Ehrman's on the phone here. He's, I'll say my number 2 on the code update. We're built with a level of flexibility to where we can, if we need to bring in one of our engineering partners or our landscape architect partner or our parking partner, we can do that. And we've got the UDO set up in almost like compartments so that we can break apart pieces and parts as we need.
And then to follow up that 2 other points, one that could be a topic that we want to spend some time on, I think for the boards would be, and we've talked a little bit about, Kelly, is density. So we probably need to kind of, I assume that's going to probably be one of those topics we're going to need to wrestle with a little bit and make sure that we're all clear what that means, where it's going to be, what categorization, all those items. And then the second part of that is, we didn't touch on, but while we're going through this, and then ultimately there will be a zoning map. And that gets to the mayor's previous point a little bit of the comp plan and CTP, because the zoning map may be regenerated or reconsidered based upon the UDO rewrite. Is that right? And do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, and that's absolutely correct, Kelly, and that's a great point. So what I'll say is we start going through the update of the UDO, and one of the tests that we do along the way is looking at not only the current town zoning map, but start looking at some of these standards, like you said, with density, and then comparing that with what's in the land use plan, and then also talking about transportation. So once we get a little bit further into the process, we will start updating and looking at the zoning map. So there may be properties that we propose or recommend, I should say, for a rezoning from something, we'll say from like R1 to something else based off of these criteria. And we realize that there is a specific process that we have to follow in order to do that. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure, we're not just taking your current UDO, making it look pretty and then giving it back to you. We're really trying to make sure we're addressing certain things, whether it's the best management practices for parking, for stormwater, for lighting, for landscaping, all of those facets. And there may be properties that we identified that aren't conforming or shouldn't be a certain zone for a certain reason.
So this is Sheila. With all of that said, thank you, Kelly and Kelly. What kind of time frame are we looking at realistically for these updates? I guess tonight I expected more of an update, and it feels more like kind of a preview of what it will look like, which is fine. But what's a realistic timeline for getting our UDO updated, including our zoning as well as our CTP? Can you give me a realistic time frame?
Sure, absolutely. And that's a great question. We could have spent 2 hours going through more detail as far as the UDO is concerned, but just wanted to be respectful of your time and making sure we got to the CTP and the town center components. The schedule is per 160D, the general standards. We have to have everything adopted by July the 1st. Otherwise, your UDO is in non-compliance and the state law takes effect. What we've done is provide staff with a schedule that says, we're going to have the initial, I'll say final drafts, probably in about November. And that's the reason we're saying, that rollout with you all in December, so that we can start kind of refining and using the winter months and the first couple of months of 2021, refining, finalizing, and getting it through to the adoption process. Including the zoning map.
Gotcha. So that's why you all were indicating filtering our questions through staff to get to that final draft. Is that a correct understanding?
It makes things easier if we've got, we'll say, one point of contact moving forward.
Gotcha.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
I want to give you all a heads up. That's an aggressive schedule.
Yeah.
You need to understand that this will be on the front of your burner for the next 9 months to really work through this, because there will be some units that'll pop up and we'll need to spend time on further. So just anticipate that this will be something that we'll want to spend quite a bit of time on over the next few months.
Yeah,
go ahead, Mayor. I'm sorry.
I think it's been some things that the board has kind of had confronted in the last few months that I think we want to make sure that that the board's thoughts are incorporated in the UDO. So
yes, sir.
We don't want to wait to the draft to kind of get that moving. And my thinking was, we're going to do a workshop and kind of generate a list of those things to filter back through Michael. Mm-hmm. or either Danny to you guys. For example, I know it's been some compassion around lately to have some type of tree protection thing in the UDO.
Yes, sir.
So we don't want to wait. I don't think we want to wait to the draft to get that done. Is that suitable that we can pass some things back, some thoughts that we have at this point in time?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the reason you're seeing kind of the town center discussion tonight. We committed to Kelly and staff that we would be flexible. So if there was a topic like you're saying, tree preservation or even the landscape provisions, that if we can break off, we will break off and move forward. We don't want to give you all something and you go, here's 300 pages, react to it.
Right.
Hence the reason we have ongoing status calls and interim status calls with staff to talk through kind of here's what we're proposing and walk back and forth with certain things. So yeah, if you all have I'll say a list of hot button items, then by all means provide that, and then we can sit down and kind of coordinate with staff and figure out, okay, if we did this, what does that do to something else, or does it do something to something else?
Yes, that's my thoughts too, that we would get those things out. So, we're not surprising at the end that we don't like it because these are missing type things.
Yes, sir. Very good question. And thank you, Mrs. Sutton,
Board,
for
ha-
putting
board
us
has any more
on the point
board
for the
members have any
calendar.
more questions?
What was that?
If I said board members have any more questions?
I actually have a quick question.
Uh,
Again, getting back to what's going on now with us, and basically it's monopolizing a lot of our time in our meetings. Would those be the items, just to confirm, that you will work on first? When you're in reference to the density, reference to the parking? I'm like, how do you pick and choose how you will move through this rewrite?
We start off with, I'll say, what are the big ticket items? So, the use table, and the zoning districts are usually one of the first things we start looking at, and then kind of backfilling and testing from there, the buffering, the parking, the signage, and
I
those
thought you
types
did
of.
say that. I thought you did say that. I just wanted to confirm that.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Now, the one thing I will say is where we can start to get a little sidetracked, if we're not careful, is I'll say if we start having something that will say, and I'm not going to bring up a specific item, but let's say that there's, hey, we want a brand new industrial district and we want that now. Well, that's going to translate across multiple sections of the UDO. So we may be more like, okay, let us take a look at this and maybe do an approach like we did with the town center. But at the same time, it may be something we say, just because of how much it affects multiple sections, let's put that in that next kind of tier to turn around for you.
Yeah, and I don't think we'll see that, Kelly. I think it's more of pain points that that we experience, that we want to make sure those pain points are addressed, and also to clear up some expectations that we have, say, around a PUD unit. What is it? What that means, and very clearly, what's the elements of it type thing. And I think the quicker we can give you what the board is desiring would be beneficial than you bring something there that is kind of far from that.
Yes, sir. Great points.
Mayor, before we transition, one thing I also want you all to be thinking about is the process. So since I've been here, the number one complaint about the UDO is the clunkiness of implementation. And what's quasi judicial and what's not, and who's responsible for approval and who's responsible for recommendation. We want to get into best practices on that and bring forth some ideas, but be prepared. I think we're going to make some pretty, I'm hoping, dramatic recommendations that will change the kind of process of methodology of approvals and recommendations of development issues and such in the UDO. So just know that's one of those items also that's out there that we'll want to spend a moment of time on. Okay, we can go back to this, but for sake of time, let's move into the town center overlay today district, and what you want to present, Kelly.
Okay. So this is one of those kind of hot button items, Mayor, that you all are asking about. And for some reason, you see me kind of grab for my earpiece. It keeps telling me it's dying, and I'm not sure why. But the town center overlay is an item of considerable discussion right now, because you do have some active players that are pursuing some potential development within that area. So instead of making them wait until this time next year, well, June of next year to come through, or worse yet, have them go through a
Am I the only one who can't hear
Yep.
anything?
I think it just happened.
His soundbite went out, so he'll be back on. It looks like.
I just feel like I'm too close to this freaking camera.
Somebody want to run to Walgreens or CVS for them for get some batteries?
I tell you what, I know we all been sitting here. Let's take 5 while he fixes that.
Okay.
Great
So
idea, Ronnie. Thank you.
let's just take 5 and then we'll come back. So what
Everybody
time?
just
What
mute
time?
and
Official time?
7:20. We'll come back at 7:25.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Yep.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes, Kelly, can you hear us?
Hey, Kelly, I can hear you there.
Okay, sorry about that, Kelly and everybody. I
Hey, Kelly,
Yes.
we're on a 4-minute break still.
Okay, I'm just making sure that this is actually working.
Yep, it is. 7:25. We'll be back on.
Yes, sir.
Yes. You good? Samantha going with you?
We could all remember that even though we're on a break, we are still live on YouTube. Mayor, I would like to, just for the public's benefit, let everyone know that planning board members Davian Cross and Jim Schwartz were both able to join us early in the meeting.
Okay, thanks, Robin. I believe you got everybody where they can unmute now. So we will start back. And Kelly, I hope you got your technical issues resolved and you can have the floor.
Yes, sir. My apologies, Mr. Mayor. And this is the exact reason why we like to do these face-to-face versus trying to rely on some technology. But so let's dive into town center because I know that's going to be a point of discussion here coming up in short order. And it's also one of those that we can start to kind of identify what we're doing and why as it relates to the overall UDO. So, currently the town center is set up as an overlay, which means that you have underlying zoning and you have something that lays on top of it. So you in essence have multiple sets of standards that you're trying to work through. Right now, the town center standards includes 31 specific items, and they're currently found within section 7.4 of your UDO. What we're proposing as part of some of our discussion is to kind of say, yeah, it's great if you've got an overlay, but so when you start reading your town center overlay standards, there's some good information in there. Some of the things that we're retaining, but other things, as Kelly said, we're trying to take it a little bit to the next step, keeping in mind that we are proposing as part of some of these amendments, context sensitive to the size and scope of Rolesville. We do work all over the country, all over North Carolina, different size communities, big, small, everything in between. And the one thing that we've also found along the way is one size does not fit all. So, when we start looking at some of these standards, it's like, okay, maximum allowable building height, 35 feet. Building height can be a controversial item if we're not careful, but at the same time, under current construction standards, that's only it's not getting you 3 stories for a building. Now, it does have under that next section that you can go up additional height, but for every a foot of height that you go up, you're starting to move back away from the property line. So when you start thinking about a town center, you're not talking about having buildings that are set back far apart from each other along the property lines, but instead you're looking at buildings that are more compact in shape, that there's a mix of uses, that there's this reaction and interaction between buildings and uses and residential and parking and civic spaces. So what we've started to say in kind of talking with staff is, let's take a look at this. Why? Because this is that focal point. This is what we like to say Main and Main, although it's Main and Young. So for tonight's discussion, and keeping in mind that what we're discussing here is kind of an interim or a stopgap to help and facilitate some development in and around the downtown, using this as a catalyst to move forward. The realization is that what we're talking about here is going to get refined, and when I say refined, pulled into other portions of the UDO as we're starting to redo it and reformat it. So just for tonight's discussion, what we're talking about is, in essence, taking out 7.4 in its entirety and starting to and recommending amendments to the various sections that you see on the screen right here, with creating a new section under 4.1.1, which is your use table, or excuse me, your list of uses, adding it to your table of permitted uses like we were showing earlier in the presentation, building off of and amending your masonry ordinance, creating town center parking standards, and that's a big item, ensuring that we have buffering and landscaping and compatibility standards moving forward. And then also some definitions, which would actually be placed right now in section 16.3. And you may be saying, well, why are we doing this? Well, there again, there's a need right now. This kind of goes to one of the points that we were talking about now, Mayor, of is there an item or a specific section we need to kind of focus in on, and can we do it in a reasonable fashion? And to say that is definitely doable is the reason we're here.
So what we're doing, instead of taking those 31 components that you have in 7.4, is let's create a table. Let's just create something that's easy to follow, easy to use, and you start to line out, minimum is 2 stories. We're actually saying, let's think about minimums in this case. What's the maximum by right? 3 stories. You can go higher under a design alternative. Now, in talking with Danny, I know we've got some limitations as it relates to fire protection and things like that. So we have to be cognizant as we're talking through some of these heights. We start talking about density. And then we start looking at things like building placement. That's basically what we usually call or refer to like our building setbacks. But in this case, we're saying that the buildings need to be as close as basically right up on the property line, but no more than 20 feet back. Now, and that's along the frontage. Why? Because we're trying to create that urban feel and setting, not having something that's setting 50 feet back, 100 feet back, or 200 feet back from the edge of the right of way or the roadway. And what you see as you're driving is a sea of parking and then a building off in the distance. If you think about downtowns in more of your traditional portions and communities within North Carolina, what do you normally see, especially in the downtown? It's those core buildings that are right up on the edge of the sidewalk. There's that interaction between the buildings, the uses, the sidewalk. And you're looking at your government uses, you're looking at retail, you're looking at multifamily or residential. So you want to try to get all of those things under one kind of umbrella. So there again, what we've done is take what's in the 31 portions of your standards, start to refine those a little bit and say, how does this really fit? How can this work? And keeping in mind there again, we do have the ability for design alternatives because somebody may come to the town and go, we've got an idea, here's how it will fit. And if we can do that, this is what it'll look like. So that way you're not just saying no to the first developer, first project comes through, but here's the allowances and the provisions to do that. Under building and site design, we are talking about getting into some of the architectural standards as far as what we call transparency. And that's the amount or the percent of the building that has either a window or glass door. We talk about the maximum size of buildings. And one of the things that we started talking about was, why are we limiting a single-use building to 15,000 square feet? That's relatively small. So it was maybe we talk about, a single-use building could be upwards of 35,000. That's not that big when you start thinking about it, especially if it goes 3 stories. That's a 12,000 square foot footprint. That's, like I said, not that big. We talk about blank walls. We talk about drive-through locations. We talk about street walls. And what we're talking about with a street wall is, where we have either drive-throughs or we have parking or something else that's fronting either on Main Street or Young Street. We want to have some sort of provision that either has a low kind of fence or wall that's architecturally consistent with the buildings that we're proposing. It's mixed in with landscaping, so it starts to create that visual edge right along the sidewalk itself. So we start talking about, just very simply, and this is not in the code, just the easy to kind of look at. So maximum of 3 stories, 5 through a design alternative, buffers. And when we say buffers, we're talking along the perimeter of the town center. We're not talking about around each individual parcel, because where you have like types of parcels, where you have town center coming up against town center, who cares if it's 10 feet apart, 20 feet apart, or whatever? Let's actually have those buildings closer together. Open space. There are provisions in here that require open space and civic spaces and what we like to call active use areas. And when you're walking through a downtown area and you see the sidewalk cafe or you see those outdoor seating areas, that's what we're talking about. So we're encouraging the use of those as part of the building. Compatibility. There again, along the exterior of the property, we're talking about what's going on right across. And then parking, which we talked about a little bit as well. So under your current list of your table of uses, what we've done is to add the TC under this in this last column. Now you may be asking yourself, wait a minute, Kelly, you showed us something that was really a little bit better looking, had some color to it. We're going to get to that level as part of the final UDO, but for the time being, the recommendation is let's add the town center into this and kind of keep it moving forward instead of trying to recreate or create the entire town center in its entirety. Open space. And there again, we're working on actually creating these as graphics, not utilizing the images that you see here. But what we are actually saying is that there are requirements for those civic spaces, for those open spaces with all projects. Why? Because open spaces is critical not only to the businesses that are there and those public gathering spaces, but also for the residents. Yes, you have, in this case, you have the park right beside, but do we want to have everybody that lives there go across or out to someplace else when there could be something right in that town center component? So we've actually proposed and identified standards within the town center that would address these types of things. This is kind of giving you an idea as far as, if you're proposing a plaza, which is one of the open space provisions we have, gives you the definition as part of the description, the components, and what are the features. So that as Danny and Julie are seeing projects come through, they can say, okay, tell me the type of open, or show me the open space that you have, and how does it meet these standards? Now, you may be saying, well, Kelly, I'm not seeing a whole lot of detail in here. There is about 20 plus pages of text that we have that we provided to staff to kind of finalize and move forward so that you all can see that. But we wanted to kind of give you the idea of here's what we're talking about and why. There again, buffers. We showed you the graphic earlier as far as those perimeter buffers. What does that look like along the edge of the periphery of the property, not the internal? And this is a big one that we want to make sure we're talking about as well, and that's the step back provisions. So once you get above a certain height, so we talked about 3 stories the maximum and potentially going upwards of 5. In order to get additional height, then that portion of the building would actually need to push back or step back away from the property line, so that you don't have, in this case, the 5-story building or a 4-story building right up against the single family home. So, or a small single family building. So that way we're actually putting in provisions that say, here's what you can do by right. If you want to go taller or higher, here's what you have to do to make it work. And this way, we're ensuring that there is light and air and there again, we're not creating that canyon effect of buildings. So we talked a little bit about the transparency, and what we're talking about is actually looking at the percentage of, like I said, walls that have a glass window or glass doors, and saying that, those buildings need to have a certain percentage. The other aspect of that is we don't want to see a bunch of blank walls. Why? It's unattractive. Let's make sure that what we're doing here is going to fit within the context of the town. What is building height? We are defining that building height as, what is that habitable space? And that's a big item, because we start looking at the ground floor versus the 2nd story and 3rd, and then also defining what is that non-habitable. Now, keeping in mind your current code has certain provisions for spires and things like that, and it's really kind of out of context with the community. But so what we're trying to do is refine those standards down and make it, like I said, a little bit more easy to understand and apply. What we talked about, and going back to that table that we were just looking at a few minutes ago, the build to zone. So how much of that building needs to be along the frontage or within 20 feet of that frontage, and how are we meeting certain standards? So we've actually provided standards within the proposed code that says the buildings have to meet a certain distance from we'll say the back of the sidewalk, and that there needs to be a certain percent of that building there. Now, you can have portions of the building stepping back or setting back away, but we're saying it's got to be a certain thing, or you have to do alternatives, whether it's the street wall or additional components. So what does that look like when you start looking and thinking about some of the standards we're talking about? Well, literally what we're trying to get at the end of the day are the images on the right-hand side of this, to where, it's that mixed-use building. It's encouraging that pedestrian activity. We still have our parking, but we have places for people to gather, to eat, to walk, to park, to live, to shop, all of those things under one umbrella.
Ellie?
Yes, sir.
If I can ask a question, I see
Yes.
on-street parking. Are you proposing any parking requirements other than on-street parking?
We've actually made provisions or allowances for that. We're not saying it's a thou shall situation, because we know that there may be some instances where you don't want to have on-street. But if you can provide it and it's acceptable, then we were saying that you can have a certain percentage on street, and it has to be located within a certain distance, and using an actual either sidewalk, pathway or improved surface. You can't have it, we'll say, around the back of the building or on somebody else's property without something being in place. And there again, it would be fairly limited in what we're talking about in the applications of those.
Okay.
So from a parking, you saw the big table earlier. What we said was, let's keep it simple, because town centers are intended to be mixed use. So what is that mixed use residential standard and a non-residential? We also understand that, in looking at a lot of different codes and different types of town centers, that, there is this inherent sharing of parking because, somebody that's living there, they're not there during the day, they're gone somewhere else, and the people are working, and then the reverse happens at the end of the day. So, what we're saying is we built into the equation a level of shared parking, and at the same time, provisions to where we're not having a sea of parking for every single property. Because there again, the more building, the more use we're getting on that, that's more tax revenue coming into the town at that point. And there again, just making sure that to identify that we are allowing for that alternative parking plan moving forward. So with that, I'll see if there's any questions. And I guess, Kelly, did we give them the proposed code text at this point? Okay. I just making sure, because I know we're refining a few things with Danny and Julie.
I have a question, Kelly.
Yes, ma'am.
This is Sheila. Early on in the slide, and I don't know which one it was, it might have been like the third one, it talked about density, and I thought it said on the top floor or second floor that it was no amount of, there it is, yeah, there it was.
Yes.
No density standard for upper story residential when part of a mixed use building and or live work unit. Can you explain that to me?
Sure. The easy thing I'll start off with is your current land use plan actually has a provision there right now that says the density, you don't have to calculate density for the upper story if it's part of that. One thing that a lot of people will start to look at and get confused about is they see no density standard, but you're still regulated by total building height and your parking and those other provisions. So we're saying, if it's part of a mixed use building where there's commercial or office on the first floor and you want to do 2 stories of residential above that, then, don't count that. Don't have a standard for that. But if you want to do a standalone residential building, absolutely, you need to be counting all of those components.
But what does that look like practically? I'm just not clear.
And I know, let's see. Well, like I said, the one image I was just showing you. Well, let's use this for example.
Okay.
If this was a mixed-use building, then this first floor is going to be commercial or retail.
Right.
And if we've got 10 acres and we've got certain things on there, we know that the parking is pretty much going to regulate everything that we're doing at the end of the day. Because we have certain amount of habitable space per unit. We have certain things that say you can only go up to 3 stories, so you're already self-limiting at that point. Somebody's not going to be able to come in there and throw 60 units per acre on a piece of property. Physically, it won't fit. Not when you start talking about, like I said, the parking, the open space, the compatibility or the setbacks, as well as stormwater.
Okay, so when I saw that statement that I went back to, I got a little confused because it wasn't kind of an all-inclusive statement. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, and there again, Ms. Sutton, that's actually currently in your land use plan as it stands right now. It's actually not a bad standard, and what we will do is actually provide a couple of examples, kind of some visuals, just so it helps explain what we're talking about and why.
Okay, good. That's good. I like visuals. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Kelly, this is Davian. I don't know if you can hear me.
Sure.
Sorry. Let's say a developer, a developer comes in and they want to put in a huge community, and let's say they actually wanted to put in a residential mixed use of commercial shopping, etc. in that community, can they use these these town center standards, or will we need to create an all new standard?
Great question, Mr. Cross. So from the town center standard, the town center is pretty much consistent with the area that you see right there. So we're not going to see a whole lot of development. Now, once we start getting out in some of the other areas, we've already talked to the staff and said, we're going to have similar standards or a similar approach to standards for some of these other mixed use areas further out. And they're all still going to be refined or defined by that zoning map. So, you know, somebody comes in, I mean, it's not going to be 300 acres that's set aside as mixed use. You know, it may be 20 or 40 based off of your land use plan. So the answer to the question is we are providing town center standards and then suburban mixed use standards, so that there is a little bit of different approach. Yes, sir.
Great, thank you.
So Kelly, this is Donnie Lawrence. So on the town center standards, I see you're showing 20 units per acre. I'm assuming that's living units, correct?
That is correct.
So in a town center standard, you could have, 20, there you go, 20 units.
Mm-hmm.
Residential, okay, 20 units per acre, okay. Just double checking on that.
Yes, sir. And there again, keeping in mind that's if it is a single, what we're saying, a single use building. So if it's a standalone residential, that's where the density calculation kicks in.
Okay, thank you.
Kelly, this is Paul Vilga. Will there be an updated sign standard for this overlay?
Yes, absolutely. And James, if can you come off mute for a second? If he's
Yeah,
able
hey
to,
Kelly, what's up?
Robin.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So James Ehrman, who, like I said, is my number 2 on this. In addition to the landscaping and buffering standards, there actually is, we've been working with staff to identify new sign standards. And James, I'm not seeing that in the current code. So right now, the current sign standards would apply, but we are proposing a number of changes to the way the signs are defined. You know, I'm not going to sit there and say colors and things like that, but the sign sizes, the types, the locations, and things of that nature. The biggest thing is making sure we're consistent with the Supreme Court from a couple of years ago.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. These are great questions.
So Kelly, this is probably for Kelly and Danny. So I'm gonna give Danny a moment and Dave. This is a briefing, I will call this.
Correct.
This is not this is the intro to details forthcoming, which should be close for prime time distribution. So let's spend a moment talking about steps, Dave, Danny, and Kelly, on this. Since both bodies have just reviewed a briefing, but not seen the details, I do think there's another meeting in order to look at the details. I think we need to think about whether we want to, it makes some sense in our world probably to have the planning commission take a first crack at those, but I don't know, town board, if you want to have another joint work session with the details, so that you can see at the same time as planning commission, and then we can get the review, we can get the text amendment process going. We can do either way. Just knowing that there's a lot behind all this, and deserves a lot more time, or at least deserves you to read it and try and understand the details. So, Danny, this would be a similar text amendment. It gets a stop at the planning commission in a review process with a recommendation. of potential amendments or recommendation, and then ultimately goes to the town board. Is that the text amendment process, literally?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Actually, we will be talking about two different things. One is a text amendment and also a zoning map change. Our focus will be for the town's property for now. The rest of the overlay will probably remain in place for the time being until the new UDO is adopted. The reason is we're not going to try to interject surrounding properties with this change at this moment. However, if they voluntarily want to jump into the new TC district because it would be more advantageous for development of their property or redevelopment of their property, we can do so. There is one area that we cannot touch until the new UDO is adopted, and that's Rick Edding's property over there with the furniture store, because it's in a Little River watershed. We're going to be changing the Little River watershed to an overlay, and we've got to get that in the new UDO update to make that happen for him. But text amendment, it's process.
The text amendment needs to happen first before anything, right?
We would do, yes, but we need to have the text in order to do the map.
Right. So the logic would be that either both bodies have another work session to look at the details and then start, or we roll out the details to the planning commission and let them start working on it. Is that kind of the options where we are right now?
Certainly. And we can also share with the town board as we move forward, just so that then what's the body of the text and the summaries is in advance. So that is our next step after this, is to go ahead and put that into the package to share with everyone to start the discussion.
Right.
And you all are speaking in regards to the town center amendment specifically, or the overall? I'm getting confused.
Yes, no, the town center amendment only right now. Sure,
Gotcha.
sorry. Yes.
That's correct.
Mhm.
Gotcha. So you propose, Kelly, that we have another meeting, or you're saying now send it to the planning board? I got lost in the conversation.
Well, I'm wondering. That's why I want to make sure we're clear. Let us think through it. But I know the town board likes to see details. Do you want to see I think I'm wondering if you want to see details before it gets going, so you understand it more, or are you willing to let the planning commission grab it? You get it while the planning commission grabs it and starts working on it. Does anybody have
I think Kelly, the ones that I see that is going to be the most pain for the board.
Yes, sir.
And I can just feeling the pressure, the pulse of the board. I know this parking is one of them. I can't say that the board doesn't trust, but I think the board needs to be convinced somehow, reassured, that these standards changes are good. And I'm not proposing how to do that, but I think it's going to take some work there rather than just presenting the change. I mean, and I don't know if there's some best practices that can be shared from some of the successes or somewhere, but I do think the feeling that my board has from a standpoint of parking, it's going to have to be really reassuring that that they can understand that it's not going to present any problems in the future.
I understand that, Mayor. And I guess just for general clarification, one of the things that we're doing when we're talking with staff is, because Danny's really, really good about asking me questions about, well, where did this come from? How does this apply? So he tests me every time we're talking on this, which I love. But yeah, we are providing some examples of here's where this code or a similar type of code has worked. And if the concern is on too much parking versus not enough, or are we accommodating future growth, then just make sure that Danny or Kelly know that, so we can help kind of frame those examples and those discussions.
Yeah, and I think we need to internally, this is for, town manager Kelly, we just need to figure out how do we, because I can tell you the board is not convinced, for example, one space per dwelling is acceptable. So, we got to figure out how that can happen, and we can embrace that, because right now I can tell you that most dwellings have more than one car. So, those are the type things I think before it gets to the planning board and before it gets to the board, I think we need to have some really good understandings around that, keep from wasting time and spending people,
Yeah.
Absolutely, Mayor. And there's a couple of things that we will be able to kind of help when I say facilitate some of the understanding of that, and just how the image you see on my screen with the one space per dwelling unit, how that actually functions. We've been working with Danny, and I know talking with him and then doing a couple other things. Yeah, short answer, we'll get you there.
And I think at the end of the day, where the rubber meets the road, the board will make a decision on what that number will be.
Right.
And that's kind of what we'll go. But if it makes sense for a number, I think really going to have to explain why. And I think the board will accept it if it makes sense. But just accepting it on face value, I think it's going to be hard to sell, because I think the board already has experience with parking and don't want to make a big mistake in that, because really parking can become a real problem in the future if you make a mistake with.
So the one thing that I will share with you all is the more questions, the better, because that tells me that you're reading it.
Right.
Well, I think it probably deserves more workshop time on both with everybody. And Kelly, I think you need to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So we will have to figure that out, and how we do that. And when we get, so I think we need to think about how we release the details, what's the material behind it, and then what's the conversation, the next conversation going to be about here, so we can really get into it and understand the meat behind the briefing here. So.
Yeah, and I think from what we've seen and what we know, 90% of this is good. It's just that we need the other 10%, and probably the parking is the main thing.
Yeah.
We need to work around that before it gets too far in the presenting phase.
Right.
I have a question for Kelly. I'm sorry, Ronnie, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if the board has something, Michelle, the board has something, big red item other than the parking, just speak up. But that's the biggest one I hear, is to make sure we get the parking correct.
Yeah, that is a big one. That is probably the biggest one. But what I was going to ask was, Kelly, so you're still trying to figure out how to release the details. Are you saying planning versus the town commissioners, or the
No,
same
I
time?
think we need another one of these.
For both parties, both groups?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure, because.
Yeah, I think this has been beneficial for all of you to hear this message at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't know if it's gonna be virtual or how we do it, but I think we need to we need to give you the details, and we need to go through it together, both bodies.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's sufficient to do it both at one time.
And I want to add, I don't know if it's possible, but a parking garage option, if we had any standards for something like that. I know, I believe Holly Springs has their core center has a parking deck, just as an option. I don't know if that's far-fetched for this center or not, but if it was something we could possibly see in addition to what we're going to get.
And I will say that we actually built in provisions that would allow for parking structures in certain areas. realizing that not everybody wants to go through that expense, but when you start looking at the economics of a structured parking space versus square foot lease rate, somebody will bite on that. Absolutely. So that's the reason we put the provisions in there just in case.
Okay.
So Danny and Kelly, in the next month, do you think you'll have easily you'll be ready to release and have some material ready for everybody to get back together? In the final draft?
I must answer, I'll let Kelly answer Kepler, but yes, we need to get moving ahead on this and getting the draft out to start the discussion. Kelly, do you see any issue with that? Kepler?
No, actually, because James and I and the rest of the team have been kind of working once we found out this may be a potential discussion item, starting to craft the potential, what I call strike through an underlying version of the current code, and starting to kind of work in those details. So yeah, I mean, absolutely.
Then my suggestion is that you all have a briefing tonight. You know what's coming up, and that we get on your docket here soon to go into the details. So we'll work on that date and see if we can get that scheduled. Is that appropriate, Mayor?
Yeah, I think that's really good. That's really good. Let's do that.
I like it.
Okay, well, Kelly and Allison, any last comments and wrap up before we depart tonight?
The only thing I would say is thank you for the questions. And I'll say some of the initial comments, because that's going to help us continue to formulate and move the UDO forward. So thank you.
And yeah, I appreciate the time today. And again, feel free to look through our recommendations that we've started down the path on for the CTP, and let us know if you have any questions along the way. So thanks again.
And Board and Planning Commission, we'll do a communication from somebody tomorrow, making that request that if you have questions, here's how we'd like to have you get those done. So go ahead and look for that in the next 24 hours from somebody on staff sending out a communication to you saying we would like to get your comments going and here's how. So
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly.
All right.
Okay.
Mayor, I think that concludes the joint work session for tonight.
Okay, well, thank you. And I want to special thank Allison and Kelly for spending some time with us to give us this briefing on what's taking place. I think all this UDO updates, the transportation plans, we really need really good product on that. And I really appreciate the hard work you guys are doing and in the presentation, taking time to come out tonight. Also thank the planning board for participating. I know you guys work very hard and do a lot of good things for us and probably not getting recognized a whole lot for that. And I want to really thank you for coming out and being part of this, because this is the future Rolesville we're deciding here, and I'm certainly glad you guys are participating and working on that. And then also the board, thank you for being here, and because you got some big decisions to make as we progress on, and thanks staff, Kelly, Robin, Danny, appreciate it. So thanks everybody for coming out. And I ask, is there any objections to adjourning?
No. Motion to adjourn.
Right. Not hearing any, I will adjourn the meeting. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Good night, everyone. Good night.
Night.
Night.